Hey everyone! Tonight we're drifting quietly back into the candlelit halls of royal palaces. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the noise of the day slowly fade away. Because tonight's story takes us into the strange and delicate world of royal courts. A place where kings had enormous power, secrets rarely stayed hidden, and the women closest to the throne sometimes lived lives that were both glamorous and incredibly dangerous. Tonight we're exploring what happened to royal mistresses when kings eventually grew bored. Because history has a funny way of showing us that rising high in a royal court could be easy, but falling from favour was often much more complicated. So relax, take a slow breath, and let's gently wander into the past. Candlelit corridors of royal courts. The kind of places where silk curtains moved softly in the evening breeze, where servants padded quietly across marble floors. And where somewhere, usually behind a suspiciously decorative door, a king was making a decision that would inconvenience an entire nation. So dim the lights a little, settle in somewhere comfortable, and let your mind wander slowly through the strange private lives of kings, queens, and the women who existed somewhere in between. Tonight's story is about royal mistresses, not the official queens, not the princesses whose marriages rearranged the map of Europe like an elaborate political chess game. No, we're talking about the other women, the ones who were adored, flaunted, envied, and sometimes feared. Right up until the moment the king lost interest. Because, as history quietly demonstrates again and again, being the favourite woman of a king was a bit like owning the most luxurious seat on a sinking ship. It looked wonderful for a while. But eventually the music stopped, and when it did, the landing could be unpleasant. Let's begin in medieval France, where royal romance had a particular flair for drama. In the 14th century, the French court was a place of velvet gowns, elaborate feasts, and extremely delicate political alliances. It was also a place where kings kept mistresses with about the same level of discretion as a peacock in a ballroom. And one of the most famous examples involved a group of women who became entangled in a scandal so large that it shook the entire royal family. The affair is often remembered as the Tower Scandal of 1314. Naturally, it involved jewellery, because in medieval courts, jewellery had an unfortunate habit of revealing secrets. The story begins with the daughters-in-law of the French king Philip IV. Three young royal women, Margaret of Burgundy, Blanche of Burgundy, and Joan of Burgundy. Now, technically, they were princesses, not mistresses. But their story reveals something very important about how royal relationships worked. Kings and princes were expected to enjoy romantic freedom. Women, however, were not. Margaret and Blanche, it was discovered, had taken lovers. Two handsome knights named the D'Aulnay brothers. And unfortunately for everyone involved, someone noticed that the knights were wearing little embroidered purses that looked suspiciously like gifts originally given to the princesses. Which is the medieval equivalent of getting caught because your secret boyfriend is wearing the scarf you knitted him. King Philip IV was not amused. In fact, he reacted with the calm restraint typical of medieval rulers. Which is to say, he ordered a massive investigation, public trials, and several extremely unpleasant punishments. The knights were arrested, interrogated, tortured, and eventually executed in a spectacularly brutal fashion. Margaret and Blanche were imprisoned. Margaret would later die under mysterious circumstances in her cold stone prison cell, possibly illness, possibly something a little less accidental. Joan, the third princess, managed to escape the worst of it. History remembers her as the lucky one, which tells you quite a lot about the situation. Now, technically these women were royal wives, not mistresses. But their fate revealed something important about the royal double standard. When kings took lovers, it was considered charming. When women did the same, well, let's just say the consequences were less charming. As the centuries passed, royal mistresses became an almost permanent fixture in European courts. And in France especially, the position evolved into something strangely official. By the time we reached the court of King Louis V in the 1700s, the king's mistress wasn't hidden away. She was practically a public office. The title was known as the maîtresse en titre, which roughly translates to the official mistress. Yes, the French court had an official mistress. She often had her own apartments at Versailles, her own staff, sometimes even political influence, which meant that for a while, being the king's favourite woman could feel like winning the most glamorous lottery in Europe. One of the most famous of these women was Madame de Pompadour. Her real name was Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, which, slightly unfortunately, translates to Jeanne Antoinette Fish. But names were flexible things in the 18th century, and Madame de Pompadour quickly became one of the most powerful women in France. She was clever, cultured, witty, and very good at understanding the personality of Louis XV. The king, you see, was not the most energetic monarch. He enjoyed comfort, luxury, and long, gentle evenings surrounded by beautiful things. Madame de Pompadour provided exactly that. She hosted salons, encouraged art and architecture, commissioned paintings, and quietly advised the king on matters of politics. For nearly 20 years, she remained the most important woman in his life, which, in royal mistress terms, is basically an eternity. But even Madame de Pompadour knew the truth about her position. Royal affection was temporary. Kings aged, tastes changed, new faces appeared, and eventually the role of favourite shifted. Rather than waiting to be discarded, Pompadour did something remarkably strategic. She reinvented herself. Instead of remaining the king's lover, she became his closest confidant, more of a companion than a mistress, a trusted friend who organised the king's social life, including, somewhat awkwardly, introducing him to new mistresses. It was a pragmatic solution. If you can't stop the carousel, you might as well manage the tickets. And so, Madame de Pompadour stayed in power long after the romantic part of the relationship faded. But not every royal mistress managed such a graceful landing. Let's drift over to England for a moment, because English kings had their own colourful history with mistresses. Perhaps the most famous example comes from King Henry II in the 12th century. Henry was energetic, brilliant, and frequently impossible. He ruled a vast empire stretching from England to large parts of France. He also had a long-term mistress known as Rosamund Clifford. Rosamund was often called the Fair Rosamund, which in medieval storytelling usually means she was very beautiful and destined for trouble. Henry adored her. He kept her hidden away in a secluded residence, sometimes described in legend as a labyrinthine palace designed to keep her safe from jealous rivals, including, perhaps most famously, Henry's wife, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine. Now, Eleanor was not the sort of woman who quietly tolerated betrayal. She had ruled duchies, led armies, and once accompanied a crusade. She was, to put it mildly, not easily ignored. Legends later claimed that Eleanor eventually discovered Rosamund's hiding place and confronted her. In some versions of the story, Eleanor offered Rosamund a choice between poison and a dagger. Other versions say Rosamund simply died of illness. Historians aren't entirely certain which version is true, but what is clear is that Rosamund's comfortable life as the king's beloved companion did not last forever. When Henry's attention shifted, as it often did, the protection surrounding Rosamund quietly faded. And without that protection, court life could become complicated. Because royal courts were ecosystems, full of rivalries, whispers, and ambitious families. Being the king's favourite meant people smiled warmly at you, until the king stopped smiling, at which point those same people sometimes remembered urgent reasons to dislike you. Now this pattern repeated itself across Europe, again and again and again. A king would discover a charming young woman. She would rise rapidly through the glittering hierarchy of the court. She would acquire wealth, influence, beautiful gowns, and perhaps a palace or two. Then, inevitably, the king would grow bored, or older, or distracted by someone new, and the woman who once held the most enviable position in the kingdom suddenly found herself navigating a very uncertain future. Some retired quietly with pensions. Some married minor nobles and disappeared into comfortable obscurity. Others were exiled, and occasionally things went rather badly. But for now, as the candles burn low in the royal corridors and the night settles softly over the old stone palaces of Europe, we'll pause here. In the next part, we'll drift further into the lives of some of history's most famous royal mistresses, including the woman whose rise and fall shocked the court of England, and another whose beauty briefly turned the French monarchy upside down. Because, as it turns out, the higher someone rises in the glittering world of kings and courts, the further they sometimes have to fall. And, naturally, history provides plenty of examples. All right. Let's drift gently away from the velvet chambers of royal mistresses for a moment, and wander into a darker corner of medieval life. Because while kings enjoyed their romantic adventures with remarkable freedom, ordinary people lived under a very different set of rules. And when it came to accusations of cheating, particularly against women, the medieval world had an unsettling number of creative solutions, none of them especially pleasant. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's slowly explore the peculiar, sometimes absurd, and occasionally horrifying punishments that medieval societies believed would restore moral order, or at least give the local townspeople something interesting to watch on a Tuesday afternoon. Now, before we begin, it's worth remembering that medieval Europe was deeply concerned with honour, reputation, and lineage. Marriage wasn't just about love, though occasionally that happened by accident. It was primarily about property, alliances, and producing legitimate heirs, which meant that accusations of adultery had consequences that stretched far beyond personal feelings. If a woman cheated, the fear was not simply betrayal, it was uncertainty. Uncertainty about inheritance, about bloodlines, about who exactly would be inheriting the family land, castle, or slightly damp medieval farm. And medieval societies did not enjoy uncertainty. So they developed punishments designed to discourage romantic experimentation. Some of these punishments were physical, some were social, and some were simply humiliating in ways that lingered far longer than a bruise. Let's start with one of the more common methods of punishment: public shaming. Medieval towns were tight communities where everyone knew everyone else's business, often in impressive detail, which meant that embarrassment could be a very powerful form of punishment. In many towns across England, France, and parts of Germany, women accused of adultery could be paraded through the streets in what was known as a skimmington ride. Now, despite the cheerful name, this was not a particularly festive occasion. The accused woman might be forced to ride backward on a donkey through the town, sometimes holding symbolic objects like ladles or cooking pots. Meanwhile, the townspeople followed behind her, banging pans, shouting insults, and generally making as much noise as possible. It was part parade, part public humiliation, and part community theatre. The idea was simple: embarrass the person so thoroughly that they and everyone watching would remember the consequences. Naturally, this was not the sort of attention anyone hoped to receive. And yet, compared to some other medieval punishments, the Skimmington ride was almost gentle, because in other regions things escalated quickly. Let's wander briefly into medieval Italy, where certain city-states developed punishments that were a bit more theatrical. In some cases, a woman accused of adultery might be forced to stand in the town square wearing a special garment marking her offence. Sometimes it was a particular colour. Sometimes it included bells. Yes, bells. Because apparently someone decided that public humiliation was even more effective if it jingled slightly while you walked. The unfortunate woman would stand there while townspeople passed by, whispering, staring, and occasionally offering commentary. Medieval citizens were not known for their subtlety, and while this punishment did not involve physical harm, it could be socially devastating. Reputation in medieval communities was incredibly fragile. Once someone became known as immoral, rebuilding trust was difficult. People might refuse to trade with you, refuse to marry into your family, or simply remember the scandal forever, which, given the long memories of small communities, was almost guaranteed. Now, sometimes punishments became more severe when husbands themselves demanded justice. In certain legal traditions, husbands were allowed to bring accusations directly before local courts. If the accusation was believed, or sometimes merely convincing enough, the woman might face fines, imprisonment, or corporal punishment. And in some regions, punishments could be very physical indeed. Whipping was not uncommon, nor was confinement. Though medieval prisons were less like modern correctional facilities and more like cold stone rooms designed to make you regret your life choices. They were uncomfortable, unsanitary, and generally filled with people who had also made unfortunate decisions. Still, even these punishments were mild compared to the most extreme form of medieval justice: the ordeal. You see, medieval courts did not always have clear evidence. There were no forensic laboratories, no careful detective work, and certainly no modern legal standards. So when facts were unclear, people sometimes turned to divine judgment. The logic was simple. God, being all-knowing, would surely reveal the truth. All the court had to do was design a test. These tests were known as trials by ordeal, and they were exactly as alarming as they sound. One common version involved hot iron. The accused person would be required to carry a heated iron bar or walk a short distance while holding it. Afterward, their hand would be bandaged. 3 days later, the wound would be inspected. If it healed cleanly, God had declared them innocent. If it became infected, well, apparently God had other opinions. Another version involved water. The accused would be tied and lowered into a body of water. If they sank, it meant the water had accepted them and they were innocent. If they floated, they were guilty, which created an unfortunate situation where survival could technically be bad news. Thankfully, these ordeals were not used everywhere and gradually disappeared by the late medieval period. Even medieval authorities eventually noticed that burning people's hands was not the most reliable method of gathering information. Still, the threat of such punishments hung over accusations of adultery. And because women were often seen as the guardians of family honour, they were particularly vulnerable to suspicion. But here's where things become slightly ironic. While ordinary women faced harsh consequences, powerful men continued behaving much the same as before. Kings, nobles, and wealthy lords frequently kept mistresses without serious repercussions. Sometimes their wives complained. Sometimes the church frowned dramatically, but overall, society tolerated it. Which brings us back to the strange imbalance of medieval morality. For powerful men, romantic misbehaviour was a personality trait. For women, it could become a criminal offence. Of course, there were exceptions. Occasionally, a powerful woman could bend the rules. Queens sometimes protected their reputations fiercely, and noble families often handled scandals quietly behind closed doors. After all, public disgrace helped no one. But for ordinary people, life was lived in the open. Neighbours watched, priests listened. Gossip travelled faster than horses. And when accusations arose, the community often became judge, jury, and audience. So the next time you imagine medieval life as a peaceful world of castles and candlelight, it's worth remembering the quieter realities, the constant scrutiny, the delicate balance of reputation, and the strange punishments invented by societies trying very hard to control human behaviour, which, as history repeatedly demonstrates, has never been especially easy. Now, as the night grows a little deeper and the medieval town square slowly empties, we'll gently move on in the next part, because beyond punishments and scandals, there were other curious questions about everyday life in the distant past. For example, because when we imagine the Middle Ages, we usually picture castles, armoured knights, candlelight, and dramatic cloaks fluttering in the wind. Films often present medieval life as dusty, heroic, and strangely glamorous. But there is one detail that movies tend to leave out: the smell. And unfortunately, the smell was a very important part of medieval life. Now, before we begin unfairly accusing the entire medieval population of poor hygiene, we should acknowledge something important. Medieval people were not trying to smell bad, quite the opposite, actually. Most people preferred cleanliness when it was available. The real problem was infrastructure, or rather, the near total lack of it. Modern plumbing, running water, sewer systems, and reliable waste disposal are inventions that most of history simply didn't have. So medieval towns developed their own creative methods. Let's begin in a typical European city around the 1300s. Picture narrow streets winding between timber houses. Many of these buildings lean slightly toward each other, as though exchanging quiet architectural gossip across the road. Above your head, wooden balconies creaked gently. Below your feet, well, that's where things became complicated, because medieval streets were not always paved, and even when they were, sanitation systems were fairly limited. Households produced waste, both human and animal, and disposing of it was a daily challenge. Many homes used chamber pots. These were small containers kept indoors, especially during the night. When morning arrived, someone had to empty them. Ideally, this waste would be carried to designated dumping areas outside the city. But people are people, and sometimes the nearest window seemed more convenient, which meant that walking through medieval streets occasionally required quick reflexes. In some cities, residents were supposed to shout warnings before emptying their chamber pots. Something along the lines of "look out below." Although historical evidence suggests these warnings were not always delivered with perfect reliability. As you can imagine, this system did not produce the freshest urban atmosphere. Add to this the presence of livestock, horses, pigs, chickens, goats, all moving freely through the streets. Animals were essential for transport, food, and farming. But they also produced quite a lot of manure, and that manure often stayed exactly where it landed until someone eventually moved it, which might not be immediately. In hot weather, the scent could become fairly intense. Medieval cities were also filled with various trades that produced strong smells. Tanneries, for example, processed animal hides into leather. This required soaking skins in mixtures that included water, lime, and sometimes urine. Yes, urine. It turns out that certain chemical properties in urine help break down animal hair during the tanning process. Medieval workers collected it from public containers. People would literally donate urine for industrial use, which is not a recycling program most modern cities have adopted. Nearby you might find dye workshops using plant pigments, metal salts and fermented liquids, or butcher shops disposing of animal remains, or fish markets where the day's catch slowly lost its freshness under the afternoon sun. Individually, these industries were manageable. Together, they created an environment that modern noses might find overwhelming. But here's the interesting part. Medieval people were used to it. Humans adapt remarkably well to familiar smells. What seems unbearable to an outsider can become background noise to someone who experiences it every day. In fact, visitors to large cities sometimes commented more on the overwhelming mix of scents than the residents themselves. Now you might wonder about bathing. Did medieval people bathe? Yes, they did. Just perhaps not as frequently as modern societies with hot showers and indoor plumbing. In earlier medieval centuries, public bathhouses were actually quite common in many European cities. These bathhouses were social spaces where people could wash, relax, and sometimes discuss business. Unfortunately, by the late Middle Ages, bathhouses began to decline. There were several reasons. One was concern about disease, especially after the devastating arrival of the Black Death in the 14th century. People began associating communal bathing with illness. Another reason was morality. Some bathhouses developed reputations for lively social activity. Religious authorities occasionally decided that these establishments encouraged behavior they preferred not to discuss during sermons. So gradually, many bathhouses closed. Bathing didn't disappear entirely, of course. People still washed using basins, cloths, and heated water at home. But full-body bathing became less frequent in some regions. This led to an interesting development. Perfume. Lots of perfume. Wealthy individuals carried scented cloths or small containers of fragrant oils. These perfumes were often made from flowers, herbs, spices, and resins imported from distant lands. Rosewater was especially popular. So was lavender, and various exotic ingredients that travelled along trade routes from the Middle East and Asia. Nobles sometimes placed scented sachets inside their clothing. Others wore pomanders, small decorative containers filled with aromatic substances. The idea was simple. If unpleasant smells were unavoidable, one could at least surround oneself with something nicer. Royal courts in particular took scent quite seriously. Kings and queens often commissioned elaborate perfumes. Rooms were sometimes filled with incense, and gardens were planted with fragrant herbs partly for this reason. Of course, perfume had another advantage. It created a pleasant personal aura, which could be helpful in a crowded palace where dozens of courtiers were competing for the king's attention. No one wants to be remembered as that nobleman who smelled like damp horse. Now, it's also important to remember that rural life, where most medieval people lived, smelled somewhat different from city life. Villages were surrounded by fields, forests, and open air. Farm animals still produced strong scents naturally, but these smells dispersed more easily in the countryside. The air carried hints of soil, hay, wood smoke, and livestock. Not always pleasant, but often less concentrated than in crowded urban streets. Daily life revolved around farming, cooking fires, and seasonal labour, which meant that many people simply smelled like the environment they worked in. Farmers smelled like earth, blacksmiths smelled like smoke and metal, fishermen smelled like fish, and shepherds smelled unmistakably like sheep. Perfume wasn't common among ordinary villagers, but herbs were widely used. Lavender, rosemary, thyme, and mint often appeared in homes not just for cooking, but also for scent. Bundles of herbs were sometimes hung in rooms or placed inside bedding. It was a simple but effective way to freshen the air. Now perhaps the most comforting thought is this: no one expected medieval life to smell like modern life. Standards were different, expectations were different, and people adjusted accordingly. If anything, the biggest challenge came when individuals from very different environments met. Imagine a noble visiting a busy market after weeks in the countryside, or a farmer entering a dense city for the first time. The contrast could be memorable. Still, life continued. Markets opened, kings held court, knights polished their armour, and somewhere in the background of it all the smells of medieval life drifted quietly through streets and castles alike, not always pleasant, but very much part of the world people knew. So, as the evening grows calmer and the medieval town slowly settles into night, let's move gently onward. Because in the next part, we'll step away from streets and scents and enter the arena, a place filled with sand, roaring crowds, and armoured fighters, where survival sometimes brought freedom, and sometimes brought something far more complicated.